The Africa Climate Summit. In biggest gathering on climate, Africa speaks with one voice, calling for action rather than empty talk and promises, as hundreds of millions across the continent bear the brunt of what scientists have called the biggest catastrophe of our times. I believe I heard somebody yesterday call it, no, actually it was the day before, a pandemic. And here we have an image of President William Ruto. We have Sierra Leone's President CS Soepan Tuya, Environment, and the Deputy President Rigathi Gachagua. Let me see, have I left anybody out? No, I have not. And we have several statements from those who spoke yesterday captured on the front page of the Daily Nation. The President quoted as saying climate change is not just an abstract composition. It has been proven by science and emerging experience. This is why we are not here to catalog grievances and list problems. We are here to talk about solutions. Mr. Mithika Mwenda, Executive Director, PACJA, the outcome of this summit should not only provide solutions to people whose livelihoods have been affected by climate change and its false solutions, but also reflect African realities, and the core of it should be adaptation. I also see John Kerry here, the U.S. Special Presidential Envoy for Climate. Africa can benefit and the Global South can benefit only if the carbon market grows. The carbon market issue is sticky, is it not? Some have branded it greenwashing. It has to grow into billions in order to work effectively. And for that, we need to ensure its environmental integrity. And here we have Ms. Soepan Tuya, the Environment Cabinet Secretary, quoted as stating climate change has entered a new era. It is not just about an environmental or developmental angle, but it now addresses climate change in the context of climate justice. Actually, this conference, in my view, can be captured by those two words, climate justice. What does that mean? All right, here we have at the very top, Amadi accused of meddling in fake gold case. Dubai-based firm claims senior judicial officers pushing to have case dismissed. And firm surrender 3 grabbed islands in Kwale EACC to file a recovery suit for a 4th. Okay, on the front page of the Business Daily, here we go. 60% of small businesses cannot repay their loans. And let me just grab my hard copy here. And this particular report is by Dominic Omondi. Defaults linked to interest rate spikes. Female-owned enterprises hit hard. And Dominic tells us in the first few paragraphs of this report that 6 out of 10 micro and small enterprises, MSMEs, had defaulted on their MSCs, I beg your pardon, had defaulted on their loans by the end of June, reflecting a tough business environment characterized by a spike in interest rates and the prices of goods and services. A new report of the MSC Tracker Survey published by the CBK, the Central Bank of Kenya, and other partners, which tracks financial inclusion among small businesses, shows that 60.7% of small businesses had defaulted on their loans in June this year. An increase from 42.8% in October of 2022. 10 firms joined the battle for betting billions. I see on the ticker IMF to review 80.2 billion shilling climate-linked loan November. A team from the IMF is expected in the country in November to conduct the first review under Kenya's latest loan, which targets disbursements towards climate resilience interventions. Safaricom signs a 15 billion shilling loan deal with Lenders for Growth. Safaricom says it has signed an agreement to raise 15 billion shillings worth of loans from a consortium of local and foreign banks to fund its sustainable growth strategy. And foreigners buy 668 million shilling NSE shares in August. An image here of the president and Akinwumi Adesina, the president of the Africa Development Bank, and they share a light moment on the sidelines of the Africa Climate Summit at KICC yesterday. And the inaugural summit enters the second day today. In fact, Adesina, I believe, is the one who talked about climate change now being classified it or categorized it or views it as a pandemic. All right, let's take a look at Taifale. All right, it appears is still loading as I refresh this particular page. Oh, here we go. Yuko katika giza ndo swali iwapo kiti cha kiongozi rasmi wa upinzani na naibu wake kitabuniwa, huenda Raila akachukua kimoja na kumpa Kalonzo kingine, hasa baada ya kumtwika Musyoka jukumu la kuongoza Azimio kwenye majadiliano na Kenya Kwanza. Mazungumzo ya mapatano hayana nafasi bayana kwake, Kalonzo aonekana kupendelewa. So it's a political question here. They're asking, is Martha Karua in the dark? So I will leave Taifa Leo at that point. Let's take a look at the Standard. And this is it. It has to do with climate change as well. In fact, it reads, is Ruto leading the onslaught against the big boys? Okay. I will have to reload this. Let's take a look at the Star as I do that. Ruto, welcome to the future. And here he is, a tree planting endeavor. Ambitious, no time to catalog grievances, problems, but rather to unlock solutions. These were his opening remarks yesterday as he opened the ministerial segment of the Africa Climate Summit. I see Dana Koth is captured here on the front page. Grassroots voices should be forefront of climate summit. No luck for Machakos Defiler, who tried to get his life sentence quashed. Arrest of cult leader Paul Mackenzie saved over 100 lives, and that is the state being quoted there. At the very top here, that story on Kidero off the hook as he settles 427 million shilling tax dispute with the Kenya Revenue Authority. I'll invite my panelists, if they're willing, to weigh in on the Africa Climate Summit. Dr. Masi, what do you make of the agenda? You know, here they've talked about, they've made reference to the speech that was given yesterday by President William Ruto, and he's of the view that the time for blame games is over, the global north versus the global south, and we must work together as partners.
Sure. Good morning.
Good morning.
Yes. And I think the most important thing is to understand climate change as a transnational issue. It is not something that can be dealt with by one state. It cannot be dealt with by just one region. It cannot be dealt with by, specific areas. It's something that needs a cross-national and a global outlook, global focus, such that even if you were to blame one continent vis-a-vis the other one, we are not sorting the problem. And therefore, it is time now we look at it from a very collective approach and to understand that the impact of climate change is diverse. And definitely, it may impact on some communities more than the others. And therefore, the whole idea is, can we look at this from a collective perspective? That's my thinking.
All right. So you agree that it has, that maybe we need to stop looking at it from who owes who.
Yeah. Absolutely.
You agree with that?
It's not about who owes who. It's the reality that we are all faced with, all of us. And as much as we want to blame each other, first of all, we need to look at it from a collective perspective. Then in the process, we can start looking at, you're the one who is doing this, you're the one who is doing this, can you reduce this? But first of all, can we all own the problem? Because we're in it, all of us. I
believe the president talked about how we risk Armageddon. Dr. Mwangi, do you take the same view? Or do you believe that the emitters, the polluters, historically do owe the global south, which the figure I've had consistently is 3%. Yesterday, my panel talked about 4%, that Africa has only contributed 4% to global emissions, and therefore, but we suffer the brunt of the effects of climate change. So do you take the view that we need to stop looking at this issue from a global north, global south perspective?
Thank you so much, Olive, and good morning, viewers. I think the climate crisis that the Nairobi summit is having this week is a significant milestone in the discussion on climate change. And why do I say this? I say this because as much as Africans are not the polluters per se, the repercussions of climate crisis is going to affect all of us. And I agree with Dr. Masi that it transcends boundaries. And for that reason, if we are going to blame the global north and say that the global south does not pollute, then we're missing the point. Because for me, if all of us are able to come together and have an action of decarbonizing the globe, then we all stand to benefit. The president yesterday talked about decarbonization, and the time for action is actually now. Without blame game, all of us have to own up. But of course, even as we own up, we also have to admit that the biggest polluters must pay more than the ones that pollute least. Africa has a huge deposit of renewable energy, and for that reason, I believe that we can use the renewable energy, and this is the time that Africa needs to come out and speak with one voice to say that we need to move from fossil fuels to renewable energy, which Africa has a lot of deposits for that. That's my feeling.
Interesting. And I'll just ask you to weigh in on, because I know we are here to discuss something else, but you know, I imagine like the rest of us, you've been paying attention to these issues. But the Standard, this is it. Ruto heads onslaught against the big boys, is how they put it. Africa needs to take charge of its destiny, was the message that speakers put across on day one of the Africa Climate Summit, with a call to have visa-free borders and to have a single currency for trade. Here again is an image, the same image, more or less, that we saw on the front page of the Daily Nation. And it reads there, I see a quote, President William Ruto quoted as stating, "An opportunity-oriented focus on climate change is the engine for propelling Africa into a realm of stability and prosperity, elevating us to middle income status and beyond." At the very top here, ministry pushing for Kerry to waive universities' debt. Fuel price trims jams in Nigeria. Further down here, banks fear more than half debtors will default. Big story here. A central bank survey show majority of those likely to fail to pay their loans for more than 3 months are individuals and traders. And EU law change pushing oil companies in Africa. Oil companies to Africa. So there's the whole climate finance debate that's going on. And so during COP27, there was talk of loss and damage, right? Prior to that, I was informed that $100 billion had been pledged in Copenhagen in 2009. The amount that in totality has not been submitted by those who made the pledges. And now there's the loss and damage fund that is to be operationalized after COP27. But African leaders, President William Ruto, at least let me speak for him. I mean, let me refer to him because he's the one who has been quite vocal on the issue, says we need to look at this as an investment more than as compensation, because he talks about, like you've mentioned, Dr. Mwangi, the potential for Africa where renewable energy is concerned. So what do you make about, you know, pivoting in that direction? Dr. Marcy.
Yeah, so I think the president is very clear on where we should go and where we are coming from. And he defines it as not compensation, but an investment. The question is, can you really compensate for what climate change has done, the damage in terms of, say, the bare minimum, food security? And we need to link these issues together. We need to see development, we need to see food security, we need to see, you know, political stability. All these issues are intertwined. So you may not be able to remove one and say, you know what, climate change only contributes towards food insecurity. You know, I think we need to look at it like, once we have food insecurity, what happens? We get deeper into issues of instability, into issues of underdevelopment, so to say. So what he's saying is that do not look at it as compensation. Look at it as investment, because we are looking into the future. And when we talk about climate change and addressing issues relating to climate change, we need to be looking at the future. And I think for me, that is what the president is talking about. We are trying to address issues of climate change. We are trying to review damages. And so we need to look more when you talk about, you know, make some payments here. You're not really compensating the damage. I don't think that is what the global north is expected to do. What is they're supposed to look at it, perceive it like we want to look at investment. We want to turn to green energy, that we can invest so much in Africa. And I think that's my thought, that let's look at this like investment into the future rather than compensation.
So that is how they're proposing it. We look at it now, but previously it has been, you have caused majority of the damage, and therefore you have a responsibility to help us adapt and to mitigate the impact of climate change. But even on the question, there's so many sticky issues, one of them being carbon markets. Kenya signed, the president the other day signed the carbon markets law, let me put it that way. And the debate has been, there has not been fair valuation. And in fact, Ban Ki-moon, in one of the stories I read this morning, is quoted as stating, rather this is the intro to the story, former United Nations Secretary General Ban Ki-moon has called for recalibration of climate financing to, quote, the correct level of support, But the civil society has come out to say this is like licensing the global north to pollute. Your thoughts, Dr. Mwangi?
Thank you so much, Olive. Allow me to reflect back on the question of compensation versus investment. The very concept of compensation means that once you have compensated me, then the story is over. Yet, the story is not over. I don't think there's anybody who can be able to compensate for what Africa has suffered out of the climate crisis that has been occasioned by the use of fossil fuels by the global north. But that doesn't mean that Africans themselves are not contributing to green gas emissions. It just means that the levels of pollution are lower from the African continent than they are in the global north, of course with reasons. Because remember that African countries, majority of them rely on rain-fed agriculture. Remember that many African countries have rivers that have dried up today, animals that have died, and there's so much that Africa can be compensated for. But do we really need the compensation? I think we cannot discuss compensation. We can only discuss investment. Investment into the now and the future. And for me, the time for action is now. Why? Because for me, it is no longer global warming. It is global melting. And because it is melting, it is going to affect all of us, regardless of whether you are in America, you're in Europe, wherever you are. And so for me, the question of carbon markets and discussing the question of who needs to gain from the carbon law, all of us need to benefit from it. But as an African continent, even if we discussed the carbon markets, the African continent in itself, the levels of emissions are very low. So when we discuss the question of carbon emissions and the carbon markets, then as an African continent, because we are a green economy, we have green cities, majority of them, then we risk the question of politicizing the question of climate change. And for me, we need to accept that all of us have to act now. And I wouldn't say that the polluter pays all, but I would say that there need to be levels of how the carbon markets are done so that all of us as Africans, as the big boys as it were, benefit equally, but also we pay for what we have emitted, so to say. That is what I would say.
Yeah, and ultimately, of course, the objective is to reduce fossil fuel emissions or any type of GH to contain the greenhouse gases. But a lot will be discussed, including the debt burden and whether easing it will help African nations better adapt to climate change by making their resources, making them a little bit more cash. What's the word? Flash with cash. Allowing them a little bit more leeway. There's also the question of the financial systems, global financial systems, and whether they're rigged. But are interest rates the issue? Because there's a talk of, I don't know how many African countries are high risk, are considered high risk. And then there's a whole question of are the food systems as is currently rigged? against the African continent. So a lot of conversations are happening. The Nation Media Group remains on ground. We have a team, Zainab Wandati, Joe Ageo, led by our editor-in-chief. He's on the ground. Mambo kwa ground, ako kwa ground. We also have, who am I forgetting? Helen Aura, Leon Lidigu. And if you just pull out your, or rather, pick your phone, epaper.nation.africa. You'll see we have a pictorial Kenya really leading the way where e-mobility is concerned. And we have special reports from page 2 all the way, let me see, page 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. So we're paying attention to this. Let me see. A lot of content here, and we continue with our special coverage. And I forgot Mwinzi in my list of people who I'm naming. Helen Shikanda, a big team that we have there at the KICC UN. They're also at the Green Park terminus. All right, I will now transition us into the topic of conversation. I've already introduced you to Dr. Mercy Kaburu. I've already introduced you to Dr. Susan Mwangi, and this is what we're looking at. Coups in the continent. Do the military takeovers in African states point to a larger issue? It's not just one issue from my reading and from my understanding. There's a term that has been used, coup contagion. In the last, so I was listening to something, and I think Deutsche Welle, and they talked about from between 2020 and now, we've had 13 coups on the continent. And they compared that to the decade of 2007 to 2018. And they said during that period, there was relative stability, no coups to report of. Are we experiencing a coup contagion? In the same, I was talking earlier about the climate change being a pandemic, but is this thing contagious? Is it a virus? Because we had Niger and a couple of weeks in Gabon. Dr. Mercy Kaburu.
Some will refer to it as a coup contagion. Others will call it actually a pandemic. I mean, we need to appreciate that states do not exist in a vacuum. And what is ailing your neighbor could be ailing you in different ways. So when one coup takes place successfully, you should not be very comfortable as a state. It is a time you start looking from within. As much as you really want to look from outside, you want to understand from within. So when you talk about this coup contagion, it can be defined as true, really. From 2021, we've run 13 military coups. And within the Central and Western Africa, it's really contagious, so to say. You come from Mali, you just cross over to Burkina Faso, you come from, some even experience 2 coups within 9 months.
Yes.
That tells you it is deep. It's like we get into a coup, we want to solve a problem, we realize it's not actually solving the problem. Then another coup takes place. So yes, because a state does not exist in a vacuum. It exists within a space where other states, and there's a lot of interaction, there's a lot of communication from one state to another. What is going on in another state is likely to be going on in your state. And if then they are successful in one state, it means we can also try and we can be successful. So yes, there is a problem, and it is deeper than just having a coup. And I think that is what we are going to be discussing here. Yes. I
was listening to a gentleman from Carnegie Mellon, I think it's called, the Carnegie Mellon Institute. And he was saying, so he was reacting to, for example, Cameroon reorganizing its military. And he says, Paul Biya, for instance, cannot sit pretty. And they say they're working on some instrument to project which are the most vulnerable states. But on the question of coup contagion, is this thing contagious?
I'm hoping that question is to me.
Yes, sorry.
And I want to believe that this is a discussion that all of us need to get into. Just like we have discussed the climate crisis, I see the coups in Africa as not just contagious, but spiraling to even states that you would not believe can have a coup. One of the things that came to my mind when you invited us to discuss the coups is that there's no English word for the word coup. Coup is actually a French word. So that tells you so much about the very concept of having a coup. But that said, the level of contagiousness that the coups are becoming, especially in the CEMAC, in the ECOWAS region, especially regions that are francophone, is worrying. But I don't think the Anglophone countries need to sit pretty. Because for me, the activities of one state will definitely be contagious and will go to the next state, as it were, especially because the world that we live in today is a world where private media has become very important. It is not the times where we only had nation media, we had KTN, we had all these medias. Today we have private media where people are discussing every day. When you want to read about the coups, you actually will not even go to the mainstream. You will actually go to private individuals that have taken it a notch higher. They are discussing it every day. They are giving us the reasons as to why the coups are emerging, the reason as to why the countries that are francophone, the countries that are in West Africa cannot sit pretty when there are coups in at least 7 in the last 3 years. And that said, therefore, we need to think about even the coups outside of the civilians engaging in a coup, because states in themselves can also engage in coups because they have engaged in constitutional coups. So if it is not a civilian or a military coup, there are coups that are constitutional, where leaders of African countries want to change the constitutions so that they can last forever. That in itself is a coup. And I think we need to even, diversify our conceptualization of the concept of the coup to even think about the states as perpetuating the coups themselves by changing the constitution.
Interesting perspective there. So we need to take a break, but we'll come back and look at some of the issues, because primarily it is the Sahel that has been affected, at least militarily. And does this have to do with insurgency? Is it a conflagration of factors, including insurgency, the COVID pandemic? Is it that these dynastic rulers, in quotes, is it a question of democracy and the people feeling disenfranchised? Is it that these are just figureheads and they're controlled by their former colonial powers and therefore are just puppets? So is this a revolt against that? Very many things to discuss. So keep it AM Live. I'll see you on the other side of this break.